It is my honor and privilege. I'm excited. I've had the opportunity to hear Shaun before at the World Wildlife Fund, and just was so impressed with his presentation. So I'm just overjoyed to welcome Shaun Martin, who is the acting Senior Vice President for Climate Change at the World Wildlife Fund in Washington, D.C. He's worked there since 2001. The major focus of his work is climate change adaptation, or how society prepares for and learns to live with the rapid changes in climate that we're already experiencing. He helps with the WWF's nature conservation programs become stronger by helping them to consider how climate change is going to affect the long-term success of their work and finding solutions to address climate threats to people and wildlife, which he will touch upon this evening. In the days before the pandemic, Shaun spent a lot of time traveling the world to help people better understand what climate change adaptation is and why it's so important. He's spoken to groups ranging from government ministers, farmers, livestock keepers in rural Kyrgyzstan, elementary school teachers, and university students. Shaun is a native of Pittsburgh, was there for a board meeting with the WWF, great city, by the way, Shaun, and has degrees in chemistry and international economic development from the University of Pittsburgh. In addition to his job as WWF, he also serves on the Board of Trustees for the School for Field Studies, a conservation study abroad organization, and the Emerging Wildlife Conservation Leaders Program, which builds the skills of young conservation professionals. He is a regular contributor to the American Adapts podcast. I highly recommend. We'll try to make sure, Angela, we get that out to everybody, but it's a great podcast. And Shaun will speak for about 20 minutes, and then I will dig through your questions and we'll let him respond to them. So please join me in welcoming Shaun Martin. It's all yours, Shaun.
Thank you, Don. I was planning to be with all of you tonight in person, but you know what happened. We're living like this for the time being. So I'm going to share my presentation with you, and Don, you just let me know if we have any problems. I assume everybody can see it now.
I've got there we go. I've got the full screen.
Okay, so if we have some lag, I'm going to show a video at one point. If we have some lag, just let me know and I'll skip past the video. I really hope you get to see it. So we are sitting here tonight in our living rooms rather than in a common place because of the coronavirus and the pandemic that it's caused. And we're all hoping for a vaccine or some effective treatments rapidly, but if you listen to the medical experts, they say, you know, this may never go away. We might have to learn to live with coronavirus for quite some time. And I bring that up even though Angela started off by saying everything we hear about is about coronavirus. But I'm going to refer to it a few times throughout the presentation because it's a really useful metaphor for climate change. Climate change is not going away, and we have to learn how to live with that. And that's what my job is to help people and find ways to help nature live with climate change. So I want to start off, I like to use quotes from people you may or may not recognize. This is Dan Ash. He was the former head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And he said in the America Adapts podcast, as you look into the future, you can't have a strategy that does not think about and deal with the effects of climate change. No matter what your job is, where you live, climate change is affecting everything around us. And if you're planning for the future, you have to build that into your plans. So you've probably seen many climate change talks before. They all have lots of graphs and statistics and things that look like this. I am not going to do that tonight, so no graphs. I work at World Wildlife Fund, and we're based, WFUS is based in Washington, D.C., but our work is global, and we work in 6 major areas. Of course, we work to help wildlife, save wildlife from the threats that they face from people. We also work on saving forests, freshwater, oceans, and we're helping to make food production more sustainable, to take pressure off nature, and to benefit people. And we work on climate change, and I am on the climate change team. In fact, I'm the acting senior vice president for climate change. My boss left last year, so I'm not the real senior vice president. I'm just acting like one for the time being. So I have three messages that I want to get across today. The first is climate change is here and it's here to stay, and I'll explain why that is. All right. Climate change is changing everything around us. You may not notice it. Some things are very visible. Some things are more insidious, but it's changing everything. And we can do a lot to prepare people and nature to help them adapt to the changes in climate that we're already experiencing and will continue to experience for quite some time. So some more quotes. One of my favorite guys, being a native of Pennsylvania, is Benjamin Franklin. And he once very wisely said, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Had we had a little more warning about the coming pandemic and had time to prepare, had we been a little more prepared when we did find out, we would probably not be in the situation we are in today. There would still be problems, but we really didn't prepare enough for this kind of pandemic, even though scientists have been warning us that it could happen anytime. Last time it really happened was 1918, so we got a little bit complacent. So you can also, this summer, many of us had plans to maybe go away, visit relatives, and everybody has plans, but if you talk to Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get hit. So that's a modern take on Ben Franklin's quote, "We all have plans, but unexpected things happen, and then our plans are for naught." There are things we know we can expect, like the impacts of climate change. We knew we were at risk to a pandemic, but we didn't prepare. We made plans as if there wouldn't be one. Now there is one. We have to change everything. Same thing with climate change. So climate change is here. You have all, just by virtue of being here on this talk, I'm sure you've heard all of the many crazy things that are happening to show that climate change is here, like the global temperatures are rising, glaciers are melting, sea level is rising. You guys in Illinois are safe for a while. Don't worry about this one. Declining Arctic sea ice. You heard about that. Extreme events. This is one that's probably hitting us all over the world, and this is kind of what most of us identify with climate change, but they're becoming more frequent and more severe. And of course, we have ocean acidification. You know about all this stuff, but I want to give you another way to think about how climate is changing that you're perhaps experiencing. Again, it's gradual, so you might not notice. So if you do any gardening there in Illinois, I believe you guys are around, like right around where number 5 is there. You might recognize this kind of map. It's, when it's a planting map, hardiness zones, plant your broccoli March 15th and not after April 1st, that kind of stuff. So these were the planting zones for the United States in 1990. And in 2006, the Arbor Day Foundation updated this map for current planting zones. So keep your eye on that number 5 and the color surrounding it. And in 2006, you had shifted an entire zone. You're now in zone 6. And zone 5 is now moving up into Wisconsin. And I'll just, go back and forth a little bit. You can see the changes there. That's over 15 years. That's how fast the climate has shifted. Now, if we're adapting to those changes, you're planting your vegetables at different times depending on what the climate map, this map is telling you. You have adapted to climate change. So it can be something as simple as that. You're changing how you live your life, what you do, how you prepare for life with changing conditions. All right. Now here's the other part that people don't quite often sink in. It doesn't sink in for people, and I know why. It's really emotionally hard to get your head around. It's difficult to grasp this, but climate change is not going away. So when we talk about climate change and acting on climate change, we're usually talking about things that are called climate change mitigation. And these are things like don't drive to work, take carpools, use electric vehicles, use solar energy, wind energy, don't burn coal, gas, and oil. All of these things help us reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. carbon dioxide warms the atmosphere. So when most talks about climate change are about it's getting warmer because of these fossil fuel emissions, releasing carbon dioxide, and we need to stop that. That's great. We need to do that faster than ever. What's less talked about are the impacts of climate change that are already here and what we need to do to adapt our lives to those. So we're living through this pandemic. We wear masks when we go out. We're adapted to that. Same thing with increasingly extreme weather. So this picture is from the Philippines right after Typhoon Haiyan, which was then the strongest typhoon ever to hit land. And it just devastated the landscapes. And so that country has learned very quickly that it needs to prepare for these more and more of these kind of disasters. So what we call climate change adaptation. But we still have a lot of people saying things like this. And I took the guy's name out because I don't want to embarrass him. But this guy once said something like, Pakistan should think of reducing its emissions, stop burning fossil fuels, which can help reduce the risk of extreme weather events in its country. This is just not science. This is absolutely false. When you stop burning fossil fuels, there is no local effect on the climate. Your air might be cleaner, as we're seeing right now, if you stop driving so much, but it's not changing the weather. It goes into the global atmosphere, and it takes centuries for that action of stop burning fossil fuels to actually take effect. So we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero as quickly as possible, but that's not enough. We still have to prepare for the impacts that are going to happen, already happening, going to happen, because climate change is not going away for a long time. So this is a quote from my friend Cynthia Rosenzweig. She's a climate scientist at NASA, and she says, even if humans were completely stop burning fossil fuels, the Earth's atmosphere and oceans would continue to warm for at least decades and possibly centuries. Adaptation isn't an option, it's essential. So why is that? I think, you know, we've gotten used to the fact, well, if we just get serious about climate change and, you know, stop, you know, driving gas guzzling cars and flying all over the earth, that, you know, we can stop this climate change stuff dead in its tracks, and that's just not true. And the reason goes something like this. I'm sure all of you have experienced cooking on both gas and electric stoves. And if you ask people, people much prefer gas stoves to electric stoves. At least I do. Why? Electric stoves suck. They take a long time for the burners to warm. And after you turn them off, it takes a long time for them to cool down. And then your food burns. This is how carbon dioxide acts in the atmosphere. You put a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it stays there for at least 200 years. And it takes a long time for that carbon dioxide to start warming the atmosphere. Meanwhile, we keep putting more and more in it. After you stop the carbon dioxide, like by stopping burning fossil fuels, it will take a long time to cool down again, just like an electric stove. So even if, like Cynthia said, even if we stop burning all fossil fuels today, we got at least decades of this stuff built into the system that we have to prepare for. Anybody happy yet? This is worse than COVID, I know. Like, put your mask on. It gets better. Stick with me. So this map was put out a few years ago, and I really like it. It talks about the concepts of climate departure points. And what a climate departure point is, in Chicago, it happens to be 2052. That means that every year after 2052, the coldest year after 2052 will be hotter than the hottest year before. Right, so they're calling this the climate departure point. After 2052 in Chicago, every year is going to be hotter. Even the coldest year will be hotter than the hottest year before then. So this assumes that if we continue on our pathway right now, we continue to burn fossil fuels, Chicago will reach that point in 2052. If we take drastic action, though, we get about another 30 years. In Chicago, other places are have shorter time frames. So we're still going to reach that point where it's hotter than it's ever been before, and it's not going to cool down for a long, long time. But this extra 30 years gives us an extra 30 years to prepare for that time. That's why it's really important to get serious about reducing our emissions. We're buying time. Had we been given a year or 2 years notice, hey, January 2020, there's going to be a big virus that's going to wipe out your economy and people's lives, get ready. We might have done it. And then we would have had 2 years to prepare, would be much better off. This is telling us, Chicago, you have 30 years, you know, to get your act together. Well, actually, we only have until 2030 to reach the point where we're already going to make it 2052 and not 2080. But anyways, you're buying time. Okay. So hope you got that point. The first message was it's here and it's here to stay. We can still do a lot to slow the rate of climate change, and that's really important, but it's changing everything already. So another quote from J. Paul Getty: in times of rapid change, experience could be your worst enemy. And you see this all the time. We're always preparing for the last war. So before 9/11, we were, you know, terrorism meant skyjacking. And we were prepared for that. We didn't let people on planes with guns anymore, right? But then 9/11 came, and now we have a new threat. And so we're prepared for that now until something else happens. So we let our experience in the past guide us to what the future should be, and that can lead us down the wrong path. Thank you, J. Paul Getty. Your wisdom made you millions. So what are some of these impacts? You're sitting there in Iowa, corn. You call it maize. That's what the Europeans call it. Whoops, sorry. I'm trying to move my face out of in front of my screen. So this was an article from last year, but they were saying that climate extremes affecting maize production, corn production, would be the new normal by this year. And that even if we limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, these kinds of impacts on corn are just gonna become more and more frequent. So prepare yourself, Illinois. Now, Angela, you wanted to talk about energy. I talked a little bit about energy and the importance of getting off fossil fuels. So we want to turn to things like renewable or clean energy. Like California did, taking the lead to address its climate change problem, it went really deep into using hydroelectric power. And because it doesn't burn emissions. The problem was when the state had a several-year drought during the mid part of this decade, the last decade, it ran out of water to produce power in the dams. So what did it do? It had to burn natural gas. So even our energy systems are vulnerable to climate change. National security. This is, I believe, the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. It is actually sinking. It is the country's largest naval base, and it got to find a new home because it's going underwater. And this is happening with naval bases all over the world. How are the world's navies, including the US Navy, going to pick up and go? Where do they go? Do they displace people that in places that are important for security that are a little bit safer? We don't know, but we know this is happening and it's not going to stop. So if you work for an organization like mine, World Wildlife Fund, you're also worried about how climate change is affecting nature. And we see that it is really having a strong toll on nature. This particular example is from Germany on birds, but if you look at the Alaska bird populations, they are really suffering because of the oceans are warming so fast, fish are moving northward, and the birds don't have food, so they're starving and just dying. It's really sad, but that's the kind of things we have to build into our conservation plans if we want to save wildlife. Stick with me, I'm telling you, it gets better. We're all familiar with forest fires. California, the Amazon, last year, Australia. Australia's forest fires released as much carbon as the entire Australian economy did the year before. So even if Australia stopped burning all fossil fuels, fires emitted just as much carbon. All right, we're all familiar with ocean acidification, I believe. It's still safe to swim, but if you grow a shell like these guys, it's pretty dangerous. Your shell starts to dissolve and you can't actually grow shells. So things like oysters and clams that we like to eat are suffering. And we often don't hear about freshwater acidification. So if you're living on Lake Michigan, for example, the Great Lakes are also acidifying because it's also affected by climate change and CO2 in the atmosphere, just like oceans. And it's also affecting aquatic life in ponds and lakes and other wetlands. So what about Illinois? I did a little special research for you guys before I got online, and I found out some interesting facts. So Illinois, I think the last few years, you guys have had some major flooding events. And since 1950, compared to 1950, heavy downpours have increased a lot. And now there are now 380,000 more people living at higher risk from inland flooding. So I'm sure that's a major issue. If you look at what's happening in Michigan right now, they're dealing with COVID and toxic pollution and floods all at the same time. Okay, Moline, I think that's pretty close to you. This probably extends into Peoria. 95 days of mosquitoes in the 1980s. Since 2006, you now have 119 days of mosquitoes. So you're getting more mosquitoes. Not fun. Those mosquitoes soon will start carrying tropical diseases like malaria and dengue. So you're on warning. We're going to have public health crises that we need to prepare for. It's coming. And I was just thrilled, not for you guys, but for this talk, that I found out that Peoria, Illinois is the 22nd fastest warming city in the entire country. Be proud of yourselves. You made it. Climate change put you on the map, unfortunately. So this really affects every one of us. It's happening everywhere. You might think of it as a problem for people who live on the coast, but it's happening even as far inland as Peoria and Moline. All right, now I'm just going to give you this one last example. It also affects real estate. I came home one day and I found this. This is a real card I got in the mail, a flyer, enticing me to buy real estate in coastal North Carolina. Now, these poor people did not know that they were sending this to me and that I would make a mockery of their advertising forevermore. Just read this: North Carolina coastal land liquidation. Okay, was $250,000, only $29,900 now. I wonder why. North Carolina in 2012 banned sea level rise. So it was so concerned that sea level rise and projections of sea level rise would affect its real estate market. It banned the state from using sea level rise projections to protect its real estate market. And now we're getting stuff like this. Did not fool me. I didn't buy that land in North Carolina. Instead, I'm educating everybody else not to do it if you get something like this in the mail. Hope any of you didn't buy land that looks like that. It's literally in a swamp. All right, now the more hopeful side of the talk, and then I'll take your questions. So this all sounds very dire, and it is. We need to take this very seriously. But fortunately, there's a lot of things we can do. At WWF, we're helping nature adapt, and we're also helping people adapt to climate change, so we can weather through this storm. So, quote, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the guy that wrote The Little Prince, as for the future, your task is not to foresee it, but to enable it. And I think all of our job is to realize what's coming in the future and enable our future generations to actually be able to cope with and live with climate change. So one last COVID analogy. Sorry, Angela, I just can't let this good crisis go to waste as a teaching moment. So, you know, in my field, conservationists, we tend to think that nature is immune from climate change, that if we just save it from chainsaws and poachers, that it's going to last. It'll be safe from climate change. It's very similar to what's happening with the pandemic. Our frontline workers, healthcare workers, doctors, nurses are at risk from succumbing to coronavirus, COVID, as they help others with the same disease. It's the same thing with nature. Nature that we're depending on for our livelihoods, and yes, to absorb carbon from the atmosphere to fight climate change, is also at risk to climate change. We help our healthcare workers by giving them masks and all the other things that we do, social distancing and taking extra precautions in hospitals. We need to do the same thing for nature to protect it from climate change. So what can we do? So here's, let me know, Don, I think you can unmute yourself. If this video is really lagging and the sound isn't working,
Okay.
let me know.
All right.
I tried it earlier and it seemed to work. Of course, it always works when you're testing it, just never does when you need it to work. So let's go.
Breeding island, we're seeing hotter and wetter conditions. More rain means
Yeah, it's lagging on the voice.
deteriorate, they just get wet and fall apart. And that hotter weather means the chicks, especially when they're young, are exposed to warmer conditions that they're not accustomed to. And that will lead to them dying. By introducing artificial nests onto the island, which are high quality, stoutly built nests. They will survive the conditions and will allow the albatrosses to successfully raise the chick. It is fantastic to work on shy albatross. It also gives us a bit of a window into how climate change will impact on threatened species.
Oops, you don't want to. So did everybody see and hear that okay? This
We
is
can read
actually
the words. I caught most of it, but you could read the words.
okay. Well, the music and everything is delightful. So sorry you missed that. So this is actually a really good news story. These shy albatross that live in this very small island, the rains are getting harder. They build mud nests. The nests collapse in the hard rains, and then the chicks die. And so we said, well, let's give them a concrete nest. Nobody knew if this was going to work. You know, animals can be finicky. Try giving your cat something to sleep on, right? Well, so we put these concrete nests on the island, and no one knew how the birds would react. And you saw in the videos, like, hey, give me one of those, right? They couldn't wait. They were lined up. And so we did go back that year, and we looked at the survival rate of the chicks, and we're very happy to say that the albatross that had the concrete nest, the chick rate survival is 50% higher than those raised in the traditional mud nests. And so now we have a solution that we can help raise the population of these endangered birds in the face of climate change. Had we done nothing, their population could have gone extinct. And so this is just one simple way. There's many other things that we're doing. So I will show you now. So the first thing we need to do is monitor and research animals and their responses to climate change much more. We simply don't know, like in that example of albatross, we don't know how they will change or if they're able to change. In that case, they weren't, so we help them. But pikas, that's a pika on the left there. They're actually, they look like hamsters, but they're related to rabbits, and they live in the western part of the United States in the Rockies, Colorado. And they can only live at mountain tops. And people are afraid if it gets too warm, they can't go up the mountain to stay cool, so they might die. We're actually finding that pikas are actually doing quite well in the warmer temperatures. There's a lizard from some island in the Caribbean, and climate change is actually making it stronger and faster. So it's outcompeting other species. Penguins, someone's doing penguin psychology, but they found that their personalities, penguins with certain personality types are better adapted to climate change than others. That's evolution at work. Those penguins that have the disposition to adapt to new conditions will survive and breed, leaving the ones that can't to die off. And then coral reefs, which we're very concerned about in Palau, in the Western Pacific, their reefs are really strong, even though the ocean there is very acidic. Their reefs don't seem to be affected by that. So these are all great news stories that if we just look, we can learn a lot about how nature is already adapting. But we also need to understand what makes species particularly vulnerable to changes in climate. So WWF is very famous for its panda logo. In fact, we call the employees, staff, we call ourselves pandas. And our office is called the Panda Palace, and everything's panda. Pandas are highly vulnerable to climate change, and here's why. They live in a very small area. They don't move very fast, so they can't go north to get to cooler weather. They just don't move. They only eat one thing, bamboo. And if bamboo dies because of climate change, pandas die from climate change. And they're very slow reproducers. If you follow the pandas in the zoo, it is really hard to get them to breed and then successfully raise their young. They're not reproducing fast enough to adapt to climate change. So this is a risk for WWF. We're famous for our work on pandas, and our logo is a panda. If the panda goes extinct, our brand for successful conservation is ruined. So we're working a lot to understand how different animals are vulnerable to climate change, and then we're trying to find ways to help them adapt. One example is to build corridors. So often animals that live in natural areas but are confined, like in national parks, can't move around. We're trying to connect those parks so animals can move to cooler climates, or in the case of elephants, they need a lot of water to survive. They drink about 300 liters a day just to drink, but they also need it for bathing and cooling down. When it's getting drier in Africa, and it is, and hotter, the elephants don't have enough water to survive. So in Tanzania, what they're doing is they're building a corridor from the Serengeti National Park, where there's a lot of elephants, to Lake Victoria, which is not too far away, but there's no clear path for the elephants to get from the Serengeti National Park to the lake where there's lots of water. So they're connecting that to make sure that the elephants have a stable supply of water when it gets too dry and hot. It's another thing we can do. Polar bears, the poster child of the animal world for climate change. We all seen the sad images, and it's, polar bears do not have a bright future. They depend on sea ice, and without sea ice, they really can't survive. So what we're doing is we're finding the places in the Arctic where the sea ice is expected to last the longest. And there are areas where it will survive for decades, even as other ice melts. And we're trying to protect those areas now, so they're not exploited by people for oil drilling, whatever, in the future, so that polar bears will have a place to stay, even if most of their habitat is ruined in other areas. In Minnesota, I'm sure they're doing this in Pennsylvania, where I come from, and probably even in Illinois. In Minnesota, they are restoring their hardwood forests to what they used to look like before timber and logging. But instead of just planting back what was there using local trees, they are looking at what's growing in the south, in Illinois or further south. And so if you have a maple or an oak in Minnesota, instead of planting a local seedling, they're getting the seedlings from further south, because those trees have already adapted to warmer climates, and it's assumed that those trees will do better in a warmer Minnesota in the future. So we call that forward-looking habitat restoration. We talked about reefs a little bit. Reefs are at risk because of ocean acidification, but also rising temperatures. we're seeing in the news recently that corals are bleaching all over the place. WWF is supporting a project in Belize, which has a lot of great reefs. And it's very interesting. After the warm waters and the reefs bleach, they go totally white. They'll find some individuals that are actually still thriving. And what they do is they take, it's like, you know, your house plants, you take a cutting and you plant it in the soil and you get a new plant. So what they're doing is finding those survivors and they're propagating them, doing some DNA analysis to make sure they're not all clones of each other. And then they're replanting them in the dead reefs. And now they are thermally tolerant. They can survive warmer temperatures. And the waters have been getting warmer in recent years, and those corals are doing fine. So we're bringing back those reefs where others are dying because we're doing some natural selection. We're helping nature natural select. We're finding the ones that can survive and selecting those for repopulating coral reefs. I have one or two more examples here and then I'll finish. Mobile protected areas. So protected area is something like a national park, like Yellowstone. It's an area that we save because there's good wildlife there and we want it to stay there. In the Arctic, where the sea ice, it's not only affecting polar bears, but melting sea ice affects walruses. They like to hang out on the ice. And with no ice, they're coming ashore. And they're not coming ashore in groups of 10 or 20 or 100. They're coming ashore and congregating in the same place. 35,000 walruses in a single place. Two interesting things we're actually doing here. So you might think, okay, well, this is where the walruses come. We'll protect that so people don't come and kill the walruses for their ivory. But as it turns out, they show up in a different place every year. So you might have your anti-poaching people over here waiting for the walruses, and they're 10 miles down the shore, right? So then you got to quickly redo legislation to designate this a protected area so it's walruses safe that year. So what we have to do is create mobile protected areas. The walruses don't stay in a fixed place, so we have to protect wherever they show up every year and move our conservation resources to those new areas. The other thing we've done with walruses is polar bears love this kind of activity, right? So they're just, you know, that's just a feast. And lots of polar bears are gathering around these walrus congregations. When a walrus sees a polar bear, they get spooked and they start stampeding and they all run into water to escape the polar bear at the same time. And a lot of young walruses get crushed, stampeded to death just by seeing a polar bear. So we sponsored a project in Russia where park guards are taking dead walrus carcasses and they're moving them away from the herd. And all the polar bears are running after that free meal. And it leaves the living polar bears safe from polar bear attacks and stampedes. So just another thing we're doing to help walruses as they face really tough challenges from climate change. And finally, probably one of the most important things that we can do are to help people adapt. As this picture is from Guatemala, where we're doing some work. We're working in an area of the country populated by people like this. They're farmers. It has not rained for 2 growing seasons, and maybe it's up to 3 now. There is just no water. People's crops are failing. They are turning to, young men are turning to crime, drug trafficking. It is what's driving the caravans to the United States. Because these people have no livelihoods and they're just headed north. It's the only thing they can do. We can help these people stay place and regain their livelihoods by helping them adapt. So they have no water. We're looking for ways to help them secure water. So what you learn about droughts is it won't rain for a really long time, and then when it rains, it pours, and you get too much water at the same time. That's a great opportunity to capture water and save it for later, for dry time. So it's rainwater harvesting. And we're helping rural communities like this in Guatemala harvest rainwater so that they can use that to irrigate their crops if it gets too dry. And we're also replanting forests that have burnt down to help also retain water in the groundwater. And so by doing this, people can regain their livelihoods, and then they stop doing things like burning forests to access water and grow crops in places that are still wet. So we're helping people and thereby helping nature by helping people. So that's my talk for this evening. I just want to leave you with a few resources. I used to do this all over the world, giving these kinds of talks. I've put some courses online at WWF.adapt.org. They're about 20 minutes. Great for lay people who you don't have to be a climate expert. It teach you, what is climate change and, why isn't it going away, all the kind of things I talk to you. Interactive online courses, great for students. It's in 7 languages, so if you want to practice your Spanish or your French or your Indonesian, you can take a course in one of those languages too. We have a program at WWF called Environment and Disaster Management, and one of the things we're doing is looking how we can use nature to help reduce risks from floods. And so we have our website is called envirodm.org, where we have all this guidance on how we can restore wetlands or use forests to help reduce the impacts of flooding. We also, those talk I did about helping people adapt to climate change, we have a program called Climate Crowd where we talk to rural communities, find out what their climate change challenges are, and then do things like rainwater harvesting and other techniques to help them adapt to climate change. And finally, this isn't a WWF project, but as Don said earlier, there's a podcast run by a friend of mine, Doug Parsons, called the America Adapts podcast. He gets lots of famous people on there, and I mean more famous than me even, right? But I'm a recurring guest on there. Almost any issue you can think about climate change is dealt with there. Some really fascinating stuff that you would never think of. Like there's one on legal liability and adaptation. So just as a gee whiz kind of thing, they had lawyers talking about litigation and climate change. So it turns out if you live on the coast and your coast, if you have an acre on the coast and half of it is swallowed by sea level rise, you no longer own the land. If it's swallowed by the sea, it is now federal property, so you don't get to claim that as your property. And so this is causing all kinds of legal implications because our legal system wasn't built to handle challenges like that. We have laws that are based on assumptions that the climate is stable. So amazing podcast. Give it a listen.
Federal government now owns that half the federal.
I'm having trouble hearing, Don.
You done?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Shaun. And
Yep.
I don't know technically if you have now played in Peoria or not. I think
I have,
come here, so I don't know if you can really take your act on the road yet.
I'm claiming it. I told my mother, don't call me after 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 Central. I'm playing Peoria. She has a habit of calling at the worst time sometimes. But
Well, that's what moms are
told
supposed
all
to do.
my friends, I'm doing Peoria tonight. I've made it.
All right. I know we tell everybody here that's the big time, at this point. But yes, one of these years though, I'm going to have you out here, and
I would love
definitely,
to.
I think some of our science teachers I'll definitely love to get a hold of you. I get the prerogative. I know Angela and I, this is why we like to do this hosting. I'm going to ask the first question, then we'll get into the other ones here. I was on NCIA and doing a little research, and they said as the planet warms, unusual crops could become climate saviors if we're willing to eat them. What role can lesser known crops that thrive under adversity play in efforts to make our global food supply more resilient to climate change?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We are so dependent on very few crops: wheat, corn, rice. And that's the majority, and we have to diversify much. Rice is really sensitive. If it's dry, rice doesn't grow. If it's too wet, rice doesn't grow. Rice doesn't grow if the water's too salty, and as sea levels rises, it's infiltrating rice paddies. Corn is really susceptible to drought. Wheat also has problems, and all of these things are susceptible to increased pests because of changing, warming and wetting conditions. So we really have to look at a much broader food basket. Now, the United States, since when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, we have a lot more things to choose from. Who heard of quinoa? when I was growing up, right? But now everybody eats it. So I think we're actually a little bit prepared to be a little more adventurous with our food. We might have to do things like eating insects because they're a great source of protein. And, you know, unfortunately, but if, you know, things get too rough, we'll look at it. But it's really, you can eat lots of stuff. It's really changing our culture. In India, I don't know if you've ever had jackfruit. They're these enormous fruits. They're kind of rubbery but sweet. They're really interesting fruit. In India, that is low caste fruit. People do not eat that unless you are dirt poor. And so people won't eat it. It happens to grow very well in warmer, drier conditions, and it grows very well in India. They just need some rock star, some very popular figure like the Kim Kardashian of India to start eating it publicly, and they can solve a crisis just like that. It really, you know, takes some leadership to change our norms so that we can start adapting, and it will mean eating different kinds of things.
Okay, and I will tell
Great
you,
question.
I will never forgive Noah for letting the mosquitoes on the ark. That is one he could have left completely behind. I'd have been perfectly fine. I'm going to go through these in order here. The first question is actually if we could get copies of your presentation.
Sure, happy to do that.
All right, wonderful. So Mac, that's answered for
It's
you.
usually the first question.
Yes.
But
I took so many notes first time with you, I didn't worry too much. But
I'll send a version in PDF form to you and Angela tomorrow so you can distribute it.
that's very kind. Thank you. All right, our next question comes from Catherine. And could you please speak to why methane emissions don't get nearly as much attention compared to carbon emissions, given their longer lasting impact on the atmosphere?
Yeah, well, that's a great question too. So carbon dioxide, it's not carbon. Methane is also, this is my chemistry background. Methane is also a carbon-based molecule, just like carbon dioxide. But methane is actually 32 times more powerful in its warming power than carbon dioxide. It stays in the atmosphere for about 24 years or 20 years, something like that. So not long like CO2, but it is really powerful and it does not get a lot of attention. But when you tap natural gas wells, oil wells, it releases methane. Cows release methane. And now more and more, what's really frightening is the melting permafrost in the Arctic. There's a lot of trapped methane under it, and it is releasing. And this is really going to shift the dynamics of climate change if the permafrost gets out of control. Some interesting things we can do about that too, some interesting research. But I guess it's not getting as much attention because methane isn't something we think about in our daily lives, like filling up the gas tank with, with gas that we then burn. And it is still a smaller contributor, even though it's more powerful, a smaller contributor than carbon dioxide, but it is really powerful. And certainly us in the climate world, we'd like to bring attention to that. The other thing is nitrous oxides, which are used in fertilizers, like 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And it stays in the atmosphere a very, very long time. But compared to carbon dioxide, it's not nearly as abundant, even though we use it in fertilizer for things like corn.
Okay, great, thank you. And just thank you for a private message to me about speaking a little louder, and then we turned our volume up. That happened to me when we started. And I thought, I'm speaking low. So
everybody
if you are having trouble hearing, that can be, I learned sometimes I need to get my own volume up. So another question here, and you've addressed, since Shelley wrote this, you've answered some of it, but I know there's even more. So we've identified the problem, got it. What the hell can we do about it?
Yeah, so this is where good old American ingenuity is going to be our savior if we take the problem serious enough. There are so many things we can do that we're not doing. Just like COVID, it's not going to be pretty. Our world is changed forever, just like travel changed after 9/11. We reformed the entire federal government. We created the Department of Homeland Security. We now go through all these checks every time we travel. COVID's going to do something similar. in the workplace and how we travel, and climate change is similar. We really need to use all of our wits to start to adapt to climate change. For nature, I gave a few examples of kind of the things we can do. Not nearly enough, but at least there's some hope. So if you live on a coast, we're going to have to start planning. If you live in places like Miami or New Orleans, where are you going to go? We can't protect you. You can't build a seawall around Miami, because the problem with Miami is it's built on old corals. And so the water, actually, it's porous. The land is porous. It infiltrates underneath the city and back up onto the other side. So you can't escape sea level rise. The only thing you can do is move away. And Fort Lauderdale, just up the street from Miami, is actually encouraging no more new development, because it knows that, why are you building here? It's not going to be here in 20 years, right? So managed retreat away from coasts. If you live in a floodplain along the river, we have some perverse federal incentives to keep you there. It's a really intractable problem. Your house floods away and you have national flood insurance, you can just rebuild right in the same spot. And there are people that just keep rebuilding in the same spots. But they don't really have any other options. They can't sell their houses, because who wants to buy a house that keeps getting flooded? So they have no recourse except to live in the same place, because they can't sell their house and continue to get flooded and bought out by insurance. We need to solve those kind of problems. They're not insolvable, but it's going to take some kind of commitment to help those people move away so that they're out of danger and not trapped in this perpetual cycle. We talked about like switching crops. People don't like genetic engineering and GMOs. Those are going to save us. Crops are really easy to you can engineer corn, like corn is already engineered. Even crossbreeding corn is a form of engineering. You can crossbreed and genetically modify crops like rice to grow well in salty water, with less water, with more water, and we're going to have to do that to maintain our food supplies.
I'll tell you, I was going to tell you, Shaun, I'll jump in on the GMOs. I still have the family farm about 2.5 hours southeast of here. And so I've done a lot of research on the GMOs, because they've really changed the world. The problem is, we always make this joke, and it's not really a joke, is that trying to convince conservatives of climate change, they always bring out evidence that if you really look at it, it's not good evidence. More scientists, it's not much, but more scientists are in agreement that GMOs do not cause harm than actually agree on the climate change. Yep. But when I try to tell my liberal friends that, I mean, it's like the same thing debating on the other side. And
yeah. There is no political affiliation or political ideology that has not ignored science in one way or the other. You're exactly right. That is not a conservative thing. It's equal on the liberal side. Even my friends who work on climate change fail to ignore the science that it's not going away, that if we can stop climate change if we just try hard enough, and it's just not true. And those are liberal people who understand climate change is a problem. And on GMOs, the problem is not safety. There is concern about cross-pollinating into native species, and that hasn't turned out to be a big deal. The major problem with GMOs that people don't talk about, but it's a big concern, is the grip that large agribusiness has on small farmers, and particularly in developing countries, that make them dependent on the seeds. So it's the equitable distribution of GMOs and how they're grown, not that they're going to destroy the earth. So that's, we have to solve that problem if we're going to rely on GMOs to get us out of food crises because of climate change. So very good.
We're unfortunately running out close to the end of time here. So let me get.
I went way too long then. Sorry.
All right. I'm going to kind of pick through here. From Charles and Judy Bush, have we been lured into thinking that population growth is not a problem because food distribution is improving? What is the impact of climate change on the ability to reach the world's poor with an abundance of what we are growing?
Yeah, so if you talk to those people in Guatemala, they're not feeling the love of better food distribution. Okay, and it's not population growth as much as it is distribution of resources and access to resources. It's just unfairly distributed. At WWF, we're working a lot on food waste, which is something, 1/3 of all food grown and not consumed is just wasted. And it's a climate issue because it takes energy and to grow those crops, and they're just wasted. We could be feeding people or turning them into other products and reduce pressure on nature and the climate. So we're working on that as well. Population growth isn't really a problem. It's the distribution of wealth. I don't want to sound like a lefty there, but we can handle 8 billion people on the earth. What we can't do is handle 1% of the people having all the wealth and everybody else having access to no resources. That's about as political as I'm going to get.
Your colleague David Reed, in his presentation on water scarcity, said, yeah, there is a scarcity of water, but the bigger problem is water management.
Yep.
And so I think, yeah, the distribution and the management. All right, our final question here is from Patricia. As a master gardener and lover of butterflies, what is the future of these beautiful insects, and do you think they can adapt?
I wish I had my colleague Nikhil Advani here. He runs our program on wildlife and species, and he did his dissertation on climate change and butterflies. So it really depends on what kind of butterfly you're talking about. Monarchs are kind of the iconic butterfly that we have in the United States, and they just have a fascinating life cycle. They migrate from Canada and places like Illinois to the same spot in Mexico every year. And it's not the same individual, it's like 7 generations that move. And they're born and they continue the journey in the same way back up. Climate change is really disrupting their migration patterns. They're now settling in places that aren't protected, that are being forced, illegal logged. They get hit by hurricanes and drought. But the biggest problem for monarchs on their journey is the lack of milkweed. And we should be planting lots of milkweed, the right kinds of milkweed. Different monarchs, there's many species of milkweed, and not all of them are the right kinds for monarchs. And that's probably the best thing we can do for butterflies right now. And just providing a lot of native plants for other kinds of butterflies. We just, we've kind of, as we, become urbanized and spread agriculture all over the earth, we've kind of lost a lot of the native plants that butterflies rely on. So right now it's not so much as a climate change problem, but just a habitat problem.
And I've seen that with farms. Yeah, we're clearing everything out to plant. Well, I appreciate it, Shaun. Before I turn it back to Angela, if we could give Shaun a great big hand. Well, it's kind of the way we usually do. And I'm going to turn it back to Angela for final announcement.
All right, thanks, Don. Just for everybody's humor and satisfaction for next time we do this, there is another tab on the bottom of your screen that says reactions, and you can put a hand clap up there if you'd like to give your speaker some applause. So, and there you go, and the thumbs up as well. But I would like to also thank you, Mr. Martin, for such an enlightening and provocative discussion. Gives us some good food for thought, pardon the pun. As we wrap it up, I'd like to thank the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, who is hosting this evening. If you're not a member of the council, now's the time to join. If you are a member, now's the time to renew. So you can find all that information at PAWAC.org, PAWAC.org. I'll put a plug in for Bradley University, who offers us free office space, and thank them for their sponsorship as well, and the World Affairs Councils of America. Good news, we have lots of cool things coming on in the World Affairs Council going forward. The next program is next Friday, May 29th. Professor Peter Zinnemann, who is a professor of history at the University of California at Berkeley, will discuss the Vietnam War, especially using more recent scholarship on the war. He'll give us an interesting discussion of that at 11 a.m. next Friday, May 29. And then we're working on Friday events. In addition, it doesn't look like we're going to get back together in person anytime soon. And so we are reviving our gala event. So we're not going to have a dinner. You can have a virtual dinner program like this one tonight. On June 18th, Ambassador Thomas Pickering will join us for a discussion of current challenges to U.S. foreign policy. You'll find there are tickets for sale on the website already. For those of you who have, in fact, paid dues and are a member of the World Affairs Council, you will be getting an email with a code, a coupon, as it were. So you can have a ticket for free if you like, or you can make a donation, however you feel comfortable. But that is June 18th, our virtual gala. And so, but throughout the summer, we're going to have continuous events, big events like the special guest tonight on our third Thursdays, and then equally important, but perhaps shorter events on Fridays at 11. So with that, I too will say thank you, Shaun. If nobody else has anything that they need to announce, we are adjourned. So
Thank you. I hope to be out there in person as soon as it's safe to do so.
you know, as soon as the schools get back in, I think this would be an outstanding program to offer both college and K-12 schools and give them some tools for looking forward.
I have versions for all, so thank you very much. It's been a great group and great questions. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm hopeful to get back to DC and come visit you again.
Please do.
All right. I like the place.
Good night,
All right, take
everybody.
care.
Bye.
Everybody be safe.